Our story begins with a young couple telling each other a story where the boy was saying to the girl that her name was Katerina, and if she knew that the castle of Chan, that giant one over there, had not fallen to any enemy over a period of 200 years. And the girl, well, she didn't understand anything because, theoretically, this was supposed to be a date. So why was he talking about some castle and other things they shouldn't be there? But the boy said it was okay since nobody would go there now. The girl was still insisting that she needed to clean some things and had chores to do, household chores, not school tasks. Relax, the boy asked her to stay a little longer since he really wanted to show her that scenery because it was incredibly beautiful at that time of the day. And the girl said she didn't care because, the people who live there are nobles and they are commoners, so it's not that big of a deal, right? And the boy declared that maybe he could buy a house in that place since he would be promoted to an intermediate mage because he had written a thesis about a new golem, and the elders liked it a lot. If the elder acknowledged his thesis, he would probably be promoted. And of course, the house wouldn't be that big, but he would buy one where at least the two of them could live together. So he asked Katerina if she wanted to marry him. Oh, how sweet, right? Suddenly, out of nowhere in the beginning of the story, I'm already getting scared. And the protagonist continued saying that she had suffered a lot for him all this time, and that's why from now on, he would make her the happiest person in the world. But at that moment, Katerina told the protagonist that before he said that, he should become an intermediate mage first. Then he started laughing, and she laughed at his face. They were that sweet couple, right? Melodramatic, and I don't want to hold a candle here, being a third wheel. In any case, they were very happy that this day finally arrived for them, and at that time, the protagonist really thought they could be happy. But you know that thesis the protagonist had made and showed to the elders? Well, and you know what happened? One of the elders simply stole the protagonist's thesis and said it was his. Basically, he stole all the credit from the protagonist, and of course, he was very upset because he worked very hard for their happiness. And while he was thinking about this, all his effort was being stolen right in front of him. And that's when he realized he was totally wrong because even if he worked hard for the rest of his life, nothing would change. And in the middle of the conversation among the elders, one asked the other if he had completed that request he had, and the other elder replied that he had not forgotten. And one of them commented if that was really right since she was just a woman of humble origin. The woman they were talking about was none other than Katerina. And obviously, at first, the protagonist didn't understand anything. And internally he was reflecting that life was unfair. But that didn't mean they could just take whatever they wanted and trample on others. Meanwhile, the elders were saying that the woman was quite beautiful despite being a commoner, and internally, the protagonist was still reflecting on all the things he had done so far, all the things he had dreamed of, everything he had desperately protected. He wanted to know why they were trying to destroy everything as if it were nothing, and, of course, in light of this, the protagonist went after them, telling them to take their hands off Katerina. However, the eldest elder there questioned the protagonist if he didn't know his place because he was just trash. At that moment, the protagonist was hit with a blow, and Katerina was watching everything in despair. The last memory the protagonist had of that scene was of Katerina calling his name. And so, sometime later, the protagonist was already in the underground prison where there were only him and several rats. He knew there was nothing he could do, and grabbing a rat in his hand and marking on the wall, he was wondering how he was going to survive from now on. Seeing the protagonist holding that filthy rat, the guards began to humiliate him, saying that he had fallen quite far since he was about to eat a filthy rat. Apparently, the protagonist was imprisoned there according to the guard because he hadn't told them the entire golem thesis he had made, so he was imprisoned there because he hadn't given them the whole recipe. To make matters worse, apparently, Katerina had died, and according to what the guards were commenting to each other, she had committed suicide to protect her happiness. One of them even had the audacity to comment that it was a waste since she was such a beautiful person, and she wanted to stay with a useless guy like the protagonist. While the guards were saying this, the protagonist simply bit his finger and internally apologized to Katerina. On the guards' side, they noticed that all the rats were gathering for some reason, and another guard commented that this was very strange, so something was definitely happening. But before he could think about the situation, another guard simply killed one of the rats, which suddenly sprouted a magic circle on its belly, causing the guards to immediately panic. On the protagonist's side, he was reflecting that he was very weak. But even so, he was going to do it. At that moment, the guard asked the protagonist to stop what he was doing right now. But the protagonist only replied to the guard that he was just starting, and when he finished the ritual or whatever that thing was, he was still lamenting, declaring that if he had been a little stronger, he would not have lost her. And the moment the ritual was completed, a gigantic explosion occurred, and behind the protagonist, a giant golem appeared. At that moment, the protagonist began to declare that this was what he had expected. After all, the face they were showing now was the same one Katarina showed. In that instant, the golem attacked the two guards. Now, seeing the golem, it looks like a giant rat. Seeing that scene in front of him, the protagonist tried to think of reasons why he was still alive. And the only one he thought of was that he probably needed to avenge this cursed world because it didn't let them have a happy life together. Therefore, he declared to Katarina that she no longer needed to worry. He was not as weak as he used to be because he would obtain any power he could have in his hands, as he would change the entire world just for her. Stuff like that, you know? Now that I stop to think about it, it's more or less like this. The difference between a hero and a villain is that one gives up their love to save the world, and the other gives up the world to save their love. Manga culture, you know. It's at this moment, after that gigantic explosion happened, guess who was watching it? None other than the cursed elder who stole the protagonist's thesis. And even with the protagonist in front of him, the elder was saying that the protagonist was crazy for using black magic, and he even asked if by any chance the protagonist was working with demons. The protagonist just gave him a look. And then that other elder who had requested Katarina from him started begging for mercy, declaring that if the protagonist wanted, he could make him the master of that place. Or rather, if he spared his life, he could do anything he wanted. Faced with this, the protagonist said that there was only one thing he wanted, and that elder there could not do it because he could not bring back the dead, right? And since the world was cursed, he would destroy everything for Katarina. Well, I don't know if that's right because I think she didn't want that. But what are you going to say to a madman, right? But back to the story, changing the scene. Now specifically in another place. A hero was being blessed and his name was Laken. The king was asking him to save the world because it had fallen into the darkness of the shadows, because the demon king's army, which was corrupted by the darkness, trampled and destroyed all of God's territory and killed innocent people. This demon king's army had already destroyed 2 kingdoms, so the fate of the world was only in his hands, or rather, the hero Lakan. To save the world, he needed to go and kill the demon king. And on the battlefield, Lakan raised his giant sword, declaring to the brave warriors of the divine empire of Artenia that the brilliant light of the empire had lost its power, and the enormous shadow was engulfing the entire continent. But even in the face of this, they would not give up for the sake of their families and the world. And today, their goal was to kill the Demon King. Now, going back a bit in time, Katarina was outraged because a child had lost their hands for stealing a loaf of bread. The protagonist asked her to speak more quietly because if she continued talking, it would be her who would lose her hands. Nevertheless, she didn't stop, declaring that the nobles could only give such severe punishments so easily because they never had to worry about going hungry. So why should a child be punished so irrationally just because of the social class they were born into? After all, they weren't born in the position they're in because they wanted to be. In light of this, the protagonist commented that perhaps a day would come when social status wouldn't matter anymore and everyone could live as equals and free. However, Katarina told the protagonist that that day would never come if they just waited. The protagonist didn't quite understand what she was trying to say. She declared that they had to be the change they wanted to see in the world because otherwise the children they would raise later would go through the same things. Instead of listening to what she was saying, he blushed because of their children. Then Katarina understood a lot of things. After all, they weren't going to get married, so thinking about children was the least of it. The poor guy declared he wasn't ready yet and didn't know what. But Katarina wanted to know if he would make the change or not, so he had to agree, right? Because the boss was talking. Anyway, she was a bit upset because the protagonist was very shy, and besides, she was probably the only person who would marry him. Now, back to the present. The protagonist was still calling Katarina's name, declaring that everything would be resolved soon. It had taken a long time, but the world they wanted so much, he was almost making it a reality. At that moment, several troops positioned themselves in front of the protagonist, and Lakan addressed the protagonist, calling him the Demon King, declaring that the whole world had entered into suffering because of him, but that all of this would end today. He swore in the name of God and justice that all his evil actions would be judged on this day. And typically as a villain, because the protagonist had become one, he started laughing out of nowhere, commenting on God and justice, questioning if that was really what he planned to judge him. And if the other thought he would be afraid of some false god or his hypocrisy in the sense of justice. Lacan declared that the protagonist would realize because countless heroes of the Empire were counting on him to bring judgment upon the protagonist. And today they would surely defeat the Demon King and thus save the world. At the moment the troops were running towards the protagonist, he questioned who they thought they were to judge him, as he was the judge of this case. Besides, on the day he lost Katerina, justice also died, so he no longer believed in those illusions. So he would show them all the only thing he believed in, which was nothing more and nothing less than pure power. At the moment the protagonist summoned a bunch of golems, Lacan was at the forefront of everyone. And then the protagonist declared that he would show the hero that today was the day when true justice would be born without their deceitful faith, because a true era was about to begin. Seeing that absurd number of golems in front of them, the soldiers were shocked. They were even trying to convince each other that there was no need to be afraid, because there would be no future if they retreated now. In light of this, the protagonist just called them idiots since they were nothing but trash. Now, the status and honor they so protected were worthless. After all, they were facing real power. But enough talk, it was time to end them all. However, at that moment, Lacan charged at the protagonist, declaring that he was getting too full of himself, as he would take care of ending all his actions. Seeing Lacan's attack, the protagonist panicked because he had taken down an elite golem in one hit. Now he realized the reason he couldn't bring down the Empire of Levia no matter how many golems he sent was right in front of him. At that moment, the two called each other's names, declaring to themselves that they would die. Well, if they both die, the story ends, doesn't it? There's not much more to do, and so a bloody battle ensued, full of blood and earth because golems don't have blood, right? Anyway, in the end, only the protagonist with one of his golems and the very weakened hero Lacan remained, declaring that it was time for them to end this. Apparently, the protagonist was also taking a beating because his golem was deformed. The last words of our protagonist, the hero, were that he didn't know how rotten this world was and that if it weren't for him, he could have started everything over again after going through all that trouble to destroy all that corruption. For this reason, he cursed the hero. And not just him, his entire bloodline would suffer throughout their lives. And it was at that moment that the Demon King Seaman was killed. As many have heard, when you are on the brink of death, the happiest memories of your life pass before your eyes. In this one, the protagonist was hearing Katerina commenting that when he smiled like that and was with her safe and sound, it was the thing that made her happiest. After giving a somewhat sweet kiss, Katerina declared to the protagonist that she loved him. And at that very moment, the hero Lacan opened his eyes, but he was more lost than an onion in a salad of fruit, asking if that was a dream or if his head had just flown off his neck. Then Lacan realized he was a bit dizzy, had no wounds, and didn't know where he was because he had never seen that type of room before, so it was probably from a foreign country. But Lacan, or as we already noticed, the protagonist, asked how he was still alive because not even black magic could bring someone back to life. If it were possible, he would have done it already, right? So how on earth was he still alive? However, at the moment the protagonist looked at the wall, he saw a portrait of someone he didn't really like. At that instant, a butler called out to the protagonist, or Lacan, actually, commenting that he was very happy because he had finally woken up. Then the butler hugged him, declaring that he had been asleep for 2 weeks and everyone was thinking that Lacan had died. But as I said, it's not Lacan inside that body, it's the protagonist. Then he asked who that butler in front of him was. The butler entered into a panic, asking how his young master didn't know who he was and saying that probably the accident had damaged his memories. It's that usual cliché. But like it or not, he would have to tell him everything and hope that the effect of losing his memories was temporary. So if he told the whole story, probably his young master would remember everything. Firstly, he would soon become the owner of that place, and he was the successor of the Viscount of Lacan from the Baroque Empire, as well as a descendant of the great hero Lacan, and his name was Luc de Lacan. Yes, it's a strange name to handle, but what was more confusing than that name was the protagonist because apparently Lacan had already been dead for 500 years. Basically, the protagonist reincarnated as a descendant of Lacan 500 years in the future. Faced with this, he panicked and started to run. The butler told him not to run because he was unwell. Internally, the protagonist didn't want to believe that situation because it made no sense to him. When he opened the door to a balcony, he screamed that it made no sense, but he noticed in front of him there was a golem or a gigantic statue of a knight. If that existed, it meant that everything the butler had just said was really true. Just by looking at it, the protagonist already knew it was very complex, which meant that weapon was more advanced than his golem magic. That magic was something that only he could teach, but that thing was very advanced. When the butler appeared, the protagonist asked what his name was, and the butler introduced himself as Hans. After introducing himself, the protagonist asked what the heck that thing in front of him was, and Hans declared that it was called Giant, a bipedal humanoid weapon, and that thing is a humanoid weapon. The protagonist asked if it was made of golem magic, and Hans replied that the protagonist was half right because a giant is made of scientific hextech along with magic. Due to technological advancements, unlike golems that are controlled from afar, those giants are piloted by someone who remains inside them. The protagonist was somewhat surprised. How is it possible for a person to enter that giant thing? Hans confirmed it, and the protagonist began to reflect that this was really advanced technology because it required someone to pilot it. But that didn't change the fact that it was an incredible weapon because, the person inside that giant thing was safe from external threats and reacted faster to events compared to golems, controlled from afar. It basically covered all the problems the protagonist had in the past. After thinking about this, the protagonist simply turned around and walked away. But at that moment, the protagonist paused, declaring that if that really existed and truly 500 years had passed, then why did he have to be born as a descendant of his enemy? Sometime later, the protagonist was drinking and making a fuss. Typical of a drunkard, right? Hans was telling the protagonist that he couldn't overexert himself and that it was best for him to stay calm. In light of this, the protagonist commented that he was a descendant of Lacan, right? So what was the problem with him doing that since he was probably much healthier than most? However, the protagonist collapsed to the ground, and obviously he didn't understand what was happening. Hans began to say that he had tried to warn him because he needed to be careful due to the curse, and obviously the protagonist didn't understand. What curse? Hans was also somewhat surprised because apparently the protagonist, or Alec or Lacan, actually, where did I get Alec from? He had forgotten about the curse. Then the protagonist asked again what curse Hans was talking about. So Hans started to explain, but he talked so much that the protagonist just asked him to get straight to the point. Briefly speaking, Lacan was praised for his efforts in saving the world, but he quickly died due to the Demon King's curse. For a moment, the protagonist wasn't even aware of what curse it was. Thinking a little about it, he remembered the moment when he cursed Alex or Lacan's entire bloodline, but it didn't make sense to the protagonist because those were just words thrown into the air. And of course, now remembering that, it was very embarrassing for him. Apparently, according to the world's history, 500 years ago, the world, which was very peaceful, faced a danger capable of destroying it, and it was the Demon King. His black magic could generate golems that were more powerful than any army, and the Demon King terminated countless soldiers with just one with a movement of his hand. And in this way, everyone believed that the Demon King would take over the world. But thanks to the righteous warrior Lacan, the world found its peace again. However, the Demon King cast a curse upon the warrior before he died, which caused the warrior and his lineage to have a painful death at a young age. After reading his story, the protagonist realized that people were quite exaggerated, right? Moreover, he had never cast a curse in the first place because, did they really believe a curse could last 500 years? But like it or not, it was the protagonist's fault, right? Because in the end, he lost. Yet, the protagonist was still upset about being reborn as the descendant of his enemy. For the protagonist, the one being cursed should be him. But looking on the bright side, that was a second chance, right? And since he died before achieving his goal, if he died and met Katarina wherever she was, he wouldn't be able to face her. And since 500 years had passed since he died, the world, which was already corrupt, must be even more corrupt now. But even so, no matter how much time has passed, the protagonist was almost sure that not all of his followers had been eliminated. For him to reunite with his followers, he needed to learn more about the magic of this era. as he would use this second chance to change the world. However, after dawn, the protagonist was drinking again, complaining that he wouldn't find anyone. But leaving aside his frustration, it seemed that most people had forgotten about the Demon King, which made sense since 500 years had passed. So probably there was no trace of his existence. To make the protagonist's situation worse, his body had no mana, no resistance, and no physical strength. So what could he do? Speaking of which, he tripped and simply fell face first onto the ground. While on the ground, he began to complain, declaring that he didn't know what to do now. He started to remember Katarina, wondering if he was doomed to achieve nothing in this life because, he got a second chance and his goal was to create a world where everyone was equal and happy. But would that work? At that moment, someone called for the protagonist, apparently from outside the mansion. When the protagonist went to the balcony, asking what was happening, a person asked how much longer he would avoid them. Apparently, the people saying this were the merchants, and until the young master appeared and they had an audience, they wouldn't leave. The one saying this was the head of the branch of the Alon Durian Commercial Association. Seeing this, instead of being worried, the protagonist was happy. The descendants of Lacan were owing everyone. Apparently, it was 30,000 pesos that the young master owed, and he had borrowed that amount from them last year to develop a mine. But after the bill came, he simply began to avoid them, which showed that he didn't want to pay back. So Hans convinced Alon, commenting that his young master was bedridden because of the accident, and that's why he asked them to wait so they could come up with a plan to pay that bill. However, Alon didn't accept it because he wanted to hear it from the young master himself about this matter, and judging by their faces, it seemed they wouldn't be able to pay that bill now. Since 30,000 pesos is not a small amount, he was willing to make an offer for them to trade in their gigantic house. It probably wasn't worth 30,000 pesos since it was second-hand, so this was a good offer for them, right? However, the soldier there got very upset, declaring that this was impossible because they only had 3 giants in their entire house. So how could they defend the territory that way? Oh, and the name of that soldier, who is actually not a soldier but the commander of the knights, is Rogers. He couldn't allow that, and if they wanted to try such a thing, they would have to kill him first. Obviously, they couldn't take those giants, and Hans asked him to calm down, declaring that it wouldn't happen. At that moment, the head accountant of the land there, whose name was Dixon, commented that if they needed money, they should simply increase taxes. Hans rebuked him, declaring that their people were already in a bad situation, and since there were only a few left in their kingdom, they couldn't do that. And we'll see it in the next episode. Remember to subscribe and leave a like.